Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 21 Hats podcast. I'm your host, Loren Feldman. In this week's bonus episode, Bill Foch, a business consultant, explains why he thinks much of the effort that he and many others have put into creating employee engagement over the past 3 decades has been wasted effort. Well-intentioned, but wasted. The fact is, Foch says, employees today are no more engaged than they were some 30 years ago when the concept of employee engagement first gained currency. So what's the answer? Foch has come to the conclusion that it's something he calls economic engagement, which happens to be the name of his consulting business. What exactly is economic engagement? He says it's getting employees to focus on serving customers and doing so profitably. He says it's not so much about sharing financials with employees, but about getting employees to understand the strategies and actions that really drive a business's profitability. Foch is so convinced that he's cracked the code that he's gone beyond mere consulting and has been buying stakes in businesses so he can implement his ideas and prove his concept. So far, he says, it's working. Even in good times, owning and running a business can be a lonely pursuit. Our hope is that these weekly conversations, brought to you by our sponsor, The Great Game of Business, will let owners know they are not alone in facing challenges. Same thing with our daily newsletter, the 21 Hats Morning Report, which Inc. magazine named the best newsletter for business owners and which you can subscribe to for free at 21hats.com, where you can also find transcripts of our podcast episodes and lots of other articles and interviews. Joining me on this episode is Bill Foch. The episode is titled, The Employee Engagement Industry Has Failed. Welcome, Bill. It's great to have you here. You've spent decades working mostly with privately owned companies, and you recently had an epiphany that things haven't gone over the last few decades quite the way maybe you thought they would, and you think there's a better way of running businesses. Can you tell me what it is that you've realized?
Thank you, Loren. I think that's really an apt question, because I actually found that I was in the employee engagement industry and didn't even know it.
Explain that.
Maybe that's like a lot of good discoveries. What I mean by that is as follows. 30 years ago, I started in this space. It just so happens that 30 years ago, William Kahn, a professor, coined the phrase employee engagement. And about the same time, Gallup came up with their G12, which was a measure of employee engagement. By the way, I didn't know either of those things 30 years ago. Well, if you look at the original G12 data on employee engagement, it said that less than a third of employees were engaged at work. And it was a very damning thing.
Did that get a lot of attention 30 years ago?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it fundamentally created an industry. And it was the employee engagement industry. And Gallup's not the only company, but I think they're certainly one of the most prominent. And they have their G12. Here's how you measure employee engagement. And so that was happening. I was just working with companies to improve financial results and the lives of the employees. That was we didn't even use the phrase employee engagement. In any event, 30 years later, the same measure, same G12 measure of employee engagement that Gallup has championed, the data they share says that less than a third of employees today are engaged at work.
So 30 years later, nothing has changed?
But we've spent billions of dollars, countless research. I mean, which company, it's sort of like the quality industry, only it's sort of worse because they didn't go anywhere. Which company you know of that is not talking about employee engagement?
Well, but at the same time, we've just been through this period post-pandemic with the Great Resignation, as it was labeled, which was kind of the sudden discovery that people wanted more out of their work hours, that they wanted purpose, they wanted to care about what they were doing, and that they were willing to and eager to switch jobs to find that, and a better paycheck, of course, but purpose mattered.
Yeah. Do you think purpose didn't matter 5 years ago?
We weren't talking about it as much.
Well, I'll take that point. I think I agree with that. But when did purpose start becoming important, or when did purpose get lost? And put another way, for 30 years, I've been working on improving the business results and, of course, the lives of the employees that drive those results. So it was all about purpose and very measurable purpose.
You spent a couple of those decades working at the Great Game of Business, which happens to be my sponsor, where the focus is on opening the books to help employees better understand what drives the business and get more engaged in the business?
That was a privilege, and that was 19 years of my life focused on that. And was it great? Absolutely. Did I learn boatloads from Jack Stack and the rest of the crew at Great Game? Without question. So nothing but applause. By the same token, over time, I had another epiphany. This was in 2008, 2009, because I was working with a variety of coaching clients in those days, very much as part of Great Game Coaching. And the economy tanked.
I remember that.
Anybody who was working with a business remembered that. And every one of the clients I had exactly the same problem: a shortage of revenue and a surplus of costs. So suddenly the epiphany was, we really got to get after revenue. And it just so happened there had been visibility to Fred Reichheld and Net Promoter Score, but it was picking up momentum. And I want to tell you, we were desperate. I mean, we were trying all kinds of things, all kinds of different companies. And my compensation was tied to their results. So I had more than a casual interest. And part of the problem was there were more and more marketing dollars chasing fewer and fewer sales. So that ratio kind of went to hell. So, I mean, it was a tough time, but we were getting sort of strange results. Some companies would give us really strong scores, but then we'd ask, do you know anybody that would value the same sort of things that, our company provides? And they were kind of quiet. And then we had folks that gave us mediocre Net Promoter Scores, but they would give us 2 and 3 different companies that they thought would be valuing the same sorts of things that our company had. I started realizing the number wasn't nearly as important as understanding the why and the dialogue with these customers. And that became a new insight into what we're doing, because whether it's Great Game of Business or Open Book Management, there is at best a tangential reference to customer. And customer is at the core of what any business is about. Like, of course, John Case and I ended up writing an article that...
John Case has been your co-author. He happens to be the former Inc. reporter who coined the phrase open book management.
Precisely correct. But when John Case and I co-wrote, I believe the title of the article was Open Book Management 2.0. We call it economic engagement. And it wasn't to say anything that was bad about open book management, but it was to say, but there are some additional things that you want to consider to be that much more successful. And the notion of customer was absolutely one of those things.
What changed in your mind?
In a way, it was kind of simple, and it was spawned to some extent by the research that we've been doing over the last several years to kind of test this hypothesis. And that is that if you look at the Gallup 12 questions, you will not find the word customer or profits anywhere in there. And by the way, this isn't just Gallup 12. If you look at most measures of employee engagement, you will not see the word customer. You will not see the word profits. Because the focus of the questions is fundamentally, how can we, the company, serve the employees? Which is, it's kind of like a nice thing.
But you're saying that the focus was on serving the employee, not serving the customer or the business.
Yeah, and that may sound like a small difference, but it's kind of huge.
There are a lot of businesses who say, I put my employees first. If I take care of my employees, they'll take care of the customers.
I understand, and that I would call is honorable and a leap of faith. How do the employees actually know the specifics of what the customers need or want? What are the boundaries around what they can or cannot do, which starts bringing in the economics? So I'd simply say when Kodak went out of business, because they were for years and years and years and years and years, I mean, they built housing for their employees, that they treated them incredibly well was without question. And they ended up letting most of them go.
So what you're telling me is over that 30-year period you're describing, the massive interest in employee engagement that sprung up not only failed to increase employee engagement, it didn't serve the businesses either.
Yeah, I think folks would argue that point, and I'd love to be involved in the arguments because they can come up with particular companies that are known to be strong in employee engagement. Costco, I'm a big Costco fan. That would be an example. But I know the folks at Costco, including some members of the management team, and the notion that they are not focused on the customer is laughable. So it's the lack of focus on customer. And then the reason that I throw in profits is if you're serving customers unprofitably, then you don't get to do that very long. So if you're really going to have employees that are at the big table, right? Thinking and acting, if you're a great game of business, thinking and acting like owners, I tend to like the word partner, but thematically it's meaning the same thing. They need to understand what the fundamental purpose of the business is, which I would think is real simple, serving customers and doing it profitably. When our country was agrarian like 100 plus years ago, and most folks worked in a family business, oftentimes a farm or a ranch or dry goods store, or, a foundry. The distinction between the folks that own the company and the folks that were running the company just kind of didn't exist. They tended to be one and the same. We've lost that connection as a function of the Industrial Revolution, which was a great advance. But now as we move into what most folks would have recognized for years is the knowledge society, how do you capture the hearts and minds of the employees if you're not talking about serving customers and doing it profitably? I don't know how to do it.
So what does that mean? What are companies not doing that they should be doing?
It really spills right into the research that we did because we had to define these things really precisely in order to measure whether they exist or not.
Explain the research. You did this, you embarked on this research to see if you were right that employee engagement hadn't improved?
It wasn't designed around employee engagement, although that we kind of arrived at that perspective. It was really centered around what originally was called open book management, but evolved into what we now call economic engagement. Because the fundamental differences were just two. And that is, one, a much more focus on the customer. And I'll get back to your question there. Okay. And then number two is not so much focus on the financials, but understanding the economic drivers that drive the financials. So in an engineering firm, for instance, that I worked with, we spent no time looking at the financials. We spent all kinds of time looking at revenue per paid hour, which was something that everybody understood and what drove the economics. So back to the question you posed centered around what we tested. What we tested was, does what we now refer to as economic engagement, does it drive improved business results? That was our test question. Then we had to define exactly what we meant by economic engagement. There were 5 drivers. It starts with customer engagement, and then economic understanding, transparency, performance-based compensation, and employee participation. And each one of those 5 things were broken down into 3 questions that we would ask folks, and they would be able to objectively say, always, sometimes, never. And that allowed us to, in effect, score. But as it relates to specifically to the customers, I don't have it in front of me, but I'll get it pretty close. one of the questions, as an example, is do you systematically have conversations with and capture what employees value on a regular basis?
What employees value or what customers value?
I said employees. Thank you very much. What customers value. If any of your audience is interested in seeing where they stand, we can provide them the link. They can do the survey themselves.
Sure. Please send that to me and I'll include the links in the show notes for the podcast.
What we found was that, again, what we called economic engagement, that we were testing to see whether it drove financial results. What we found was kind of astounding. And that is, out of 8 waves of research with 50 to 150 companies per wave, 2 of which were done in Switzerland, although the rest were in North America, what we found is if the companies that were in the top quartile of economic engagement had double the profit growth of the peer group, and the peer, meaning the average, and the peer group had more than double the profitability of the bottom quartile. Well, when you see that once, it's pretty interesting. When you see it 8 times, as my Harvard Business School buddies would say, because they were helpful in the research, the likelihood that that is statistically significant is pretty high.
So I'm struggling a little bit with understanding the difference between open book management and economic engagement as you describe it. And I guess I would point out, first of all, I would guess that most of the people listening to this podcast are only vaguely familiar with open book management to begin with. I think many people are generally aware that the notion behind it is that you show employees the book so that they understand how the business works. And for example, they see profit margins for different product lines and they get a sense of which products to emphasize. That to me sounds like economic engagement. How are you distinguishing between the two?
Yeah, so the fundamental starting point is different. The starting point is not sharing financials. The starting point is reaching out and speaking with your customers and understanding what they value. Because unless you know that, you can't intelligently talk about the economics, because the economics are defined by what your customers value. No, I have not said anything about opening the books once, did I?
So how do you create economic engagement?
So the point is, so you create economic engagement by, 1, understanding what your customers want, 2, translating that into a metric that defines the economics objectively in your company. Number 3 is make sure that is transparent throughout the organization. Do you notice I still haven't said the financials? And it's not that financials are bad or that financial literacy or teaching employees about the financials is a bad thing. It's just not a necessary thing.
You're kind of suggesting it's overkill, that you can just focus on a subset rather than the whole.
Yeah, and you can get people sort of rallied around what are the customers telling us they really need. How does that translate in terms of how we measure what we're doing? And we can start making that very transparent, even tie an incentive system, and then recognize folks that are participating and making good moves and improving it. And again, I didn't mention the financials once. We may share with them that, in fact, after the fact, yeah, it's driving the numbers, and over time they may come to understand that. But the notion of starting by explaining the financials is just, it's not as productive a way to go.
It's a lot of work.
It really is. And the other thing that's true is, because I've seen this happen, we're pulling everybody together today, and we're going to teach you about the income statement and the balance sheet. Envision what the faces of the people look like as they're entering that room.
Well, I've been in some of those rooms, and I know what you're referring to, and I know it can be hard to get there, but I have been in those rooms with people who have kind of gotten there and who appreciate what those numbers mean and take it very seriously if, they're responsible for a line item and it's not where it's supposed to be. It can be an inspiring thing to see when it's working. I'm sure you've seen that.
Well, again, I want to say it's not that isn't noble or well-intended. I'm just saying most of the time it's not.
I understand. Could you walk us through an example? You consult with a company and you want to bring these thoughts to bear. Where do you start? Can you give us an example of how it unfolds and what difference it makes?
It's actually pretty straightforward. So it's, what do we hear from our customers? What do they value? If the company doesn't already have that, then there's a customer survey that we arm them with. So that's one data point. The second data point is, let's get the input from our employees, but again, very different than the like the Gallup 12 employee engagement questions. It's questions along the lines of, what's the biggest opportunity for improving results at the company? What's the biggest opportunity for increasing our sales by further delighting our customers? Is questions along those lines. And what we found to be useful is doing that with both employees and with the management team, but separately, so we can see whether the management and the employees have a similar or different perspective. Next, we're going to look at the financials, classic financial trend analysis. So in the financial trend analysis, first and foremost, we're going to look at whether they're hugely in debt. And if they're hugely in debt and cash flow negative, then the financials are screaming, and we're going to have to do something about cash. But nonetheless, looking at what are the financials telling us about the circumstance of the company. So pulling that data together is we ask them exactly the same questions as we did in the research on economic engagement, so we can see front end where they stand on customer engagement, on economic understanding, on transparency, on employee compensation and participation. It's almost like going to a physician, an internist, and getting a sense for the entirety of your health condition. And then once we have that, we're typically going to go through all of that information, because we've gathered it all at the same time. We're going to go through that information with a working group of not less than 4 and not more than 10 individuals that make up the leadership of the company, ideally including a couple of, I'll call it employee leaders. And when we're going through that, we ask each of them to think as though they were the president of the company. And this data was prepared for them alone, for them to help them think through what are the key issue or issues associated with the company. Now we've gone through all that data in a working meeting that typically takes about an hour and a half. In the first half, we're going through all the data. Now we're going to ask everybody to report out what did they see as the key issue or issues facing the company, not for all time, but for the next year. And everybody reports out, so we go from that individual perspective on the key issues to a group perspective on what the key issues are. Once we've got that group perspective, we say, okay, what would be an objective measure that would deal with those issues? I'm thinking about Adams Beasley, a remodeling company that I started working with in 2018, and went through that process. Where they came out is gross margin dollars per job, because they do large jobs, and it was a combination of more jobs was good, but higher margin percentage was also good, and the net margin dollars, and the product of those two, really drove or addressed the various issues that they had brought up. With that, we said, great, okay, now what we need to do is 3 things. Because we've got the input from the customers, we've got the input from the entire organization, we've distilled it down to that economic understanding, right? That thing that we're going to drive. Now we got to make it transparent. That's called a scoreboard. So we're making it transparent so everybody can see what's going on, but everybody can also see how they fit into the puzzle. And commensurate with that, we put together an incentive plan. So if we're successful at improving that performance metric, then how much is that worth? And a portion of what we're creating goes to the employees. The rest stays with the company. And the final thing is then rollout. Final thing in terms of launching it is rollout, where we're just laying out for everybody, hey, here's what you told us. Here's what developed out of this.
It sounds like that conversation led you pretty deeply into financials. You know, you're talking about the company realizing that more jobs is good, but the margin on those jobs might be more important. You know, that's a financial analysis, isn't it?
The comment I would make is a couplefold. Typical financials do not show that.
But it's not a conversation that comes up just by asking, how can we better serve the customers?
Yeah, but suffice it to say that financial trend analysis is absolutely one of the things that we do in the front end of this. But input from the employees on various jobs, input from the management on various jobs, and their thoughts about what are really the important things to drive the business were at least as important. And most of the time, Lauren, I find that there's a certain amount of confirmation because it's like what the customers are telling us. Oh, what the employees are telling us. Oh, what the managers are telling us. Oh, what the financials are telling us. It's not all that common that those are like four areas pointing in completely different directions. But the point that I was going to make, though, is you could say we're like knee deep in the financials, or you could say we're not at all on the financials. It kind of depends on your definition of what the financials are. We spend zero time talking about here's what the monthly income statement and balance sheet looks like. Zero. We spend all of the time focused on in the outset, right? In this first year, we spent all the time saying, hey, how can we increase our gross margin dollars? And of course, that means we got to get really tight with our customers. And it's all kind of nuanced things like when a customer asks for a change order, are we getting compensated for that?
You spent most of your career, as I understand it, as a consultant, but you believe in what you're saying here deeply enough that you're putting your money where your mouth is. And you have been buying businesses with the intent of running them with this philosophy in mind. How's that going?
Absolutely, and great. I think the notion of putting your money where your mouth is just the right thing to do. And that's one of the reasons I've always had a compensation agreement with my clients where my compensation is tied to their results. But that's near term kind of results, like, you know, their annual incentive plan or something like that. There's a next level of I'm one of two owners of a remodeling company on the West Coast. We're starting to see this as a hell of a great opportunity to do what the PE world does in roll-ups, only roll up with a notion that we're going to create a bunch of employee partners / owners. The exit strategy will likely be an ESOP. So yes, it's been going on for a while, but moving more aggressively in terms of consulting to investment.
Can you give us an example of a company that you bought? Where was it when you started? Where did you take it?
Yeah, I think of 1 Week Bath as an example where I'm a 30% owner. Think of lean manufacturing kind of concepts applied to how you would remodel a bath. This is kind of the deal, right? What another company would do in 2 months to remodel a bath, we're going to do in a week. Not we are going to, what we do is do it in a week. So that business premise was the case long before I first knew Matt. And he had like most of the folks that I've worked with, he already had an orientation towards what you might call employee engagement, but the idea of a weekly meeting, seeing where we're at on every project, forecasting out initially gross margin, now we've progressed to net income, was not really in the cards. And Matt has me being relatively quiet about our financial success. But suffice to say that I feel really good about the increased value of my $250,000 ownership.
Did you work with them to help the employees better understand how to serve their customers?
Absolutely. I think of Carson and what she's done with respect to our marketing efforts, and in particular, accelerated our repeat and referral business, or the folks out in the field and the kinds of things that they do routinely. And they do it because they know it's the right thing to do. But in particular, our scores on customer satisfaction, we're like off the freaking charts. It's the entire group that are driving that. But the folks that are on the front lines are the folks that are actually installing these baths in like unbelievable lengths of time. And by the way, are we as good as we're going to be? Hell no.
Is there a strategy behind that, or is it just an overall approach to doing everything you can to serve the customer?
It's really a great question, Lauren, because we keep learning. We see a latest Yelp rating, and then we say, who the devil ran that job? And inevitably, the individual is a weekly meeting, 30 minutes that we're going through all this stuff. What did you do? What was the magic? And then they tell us.
Occasionally, something must go wrong. How do you handle it when something doesn't go well with a customer?
It's like, I got to love you, Lauren. Yeah, absolutely right. And one of the things we got a little more aggressive about was following up with past customers, because we really weren't doing, and I'm talking about customers that we installed a bath like 5 or 10 years ago. So this is sort of a weird example of when it didn't go right, okay? So we call up our past customers, because we're looking to strengthen our relationship and so forth. And one individual, we ask, hey, we're 1 week back. We really appreciate the privilege of working with you. We're just following up on kind of how we did from a perspective years later. So tell me, it's the Net Promoter Score question from Fred Reichel. Given the work we did for you in the past, would you be willing to refer us to a friend or colleague? And the woman said, hell no. But we know that whether they say yes or no, we don't care. We say, well, the next question is why? And the woman said, the damn faucet still leaks. We installed the thing 5 years ago. I mean, there's no warranty involved. It's really a good thing that I was not on the phone. Okay, I would not have handled the call very well at all.
Wait a second, you're not good at dealing with customers?
No, I would have been horrible at this. Worse than horrible, okay? I'd have been pissed off, okay? But, whatever. Fortunately, I wasn't on the call on this one. So the individual, I think it was Robbie, says, oh, that's really, really bad. Could we have somebody come by and just fix that? And she's just the nastiest lady in the entire world. Well, what the hell are they going to charge me for that? And Robbie says, well, we're not going to charge you. We just want you to be happy. And the woman is now sort of like confused and maybe in disbelief. So Robbie says, I see that Raul is going to be out in your neighborhood like next week. Could I just schedule him to come by? I don't think it'll take much time. At this stage, she's going like, really? And Robbie says, well, yeah. Well, do you know how many referrals we have gotten from this woman now?
Wow.
And we never would have done it. It never would have happened. And do you know how many folks at 1 Week Bath know that story?
All of them?
Because it's important that they know that story. Let me tell you, you want to leave the world better than you found it? Then invest in companies that are doing this, because you'll get higher returns and you'll improve the lives of customers and you'll improve the lives of employees and you'll improve your life. And we think that's how we're going to change the world.
My thanks to Bill Foch, and of course to our sponsor, The Great Game of Business, which helps businesses use an open book management system to build healthier companies. You can learn more at greatgame.com. Wait, don't leave yet. If you have a question or a comment that you'd like the 21 Hats owners to address, send it to me by replying to your morning report or by email at lauren@21hats.com. That's LOREN@21hats.com. Do it now before you forget. And don't be afraid to tell Jay what you really think. He can take it. And if you got something out of this conversation, help us reach more business owners. Tell a friend. Subscribe and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter. Subscribe to The Morning Report at 21hats.com. This episode was produced by Jess Thuberon, founder of Blank Word Productions. Okay, now you can leave. Thanks for listening, everyone.